The cold in the Ardennes forest in December 1944 was a physical presence, a sharp, crystalline entity that seeped through wool greatcoats and settled deep in the bones. For Corporal Klaus Richter, a veteran of the frozen hells of the Eastern Front, this cold was familiar, almost a comrade. But on the morning of December 18th, as he crouched in a foxhole near the Belgian town of Saint-Vith, a different kind of chill gripped him, one born not of temperature, but of a profound and unsettling dread. The great German offensive walk down Rhine was only 2 days old. Their panzer divisions had achieved what was thought impossible. They had shattered the thin American lines, driving a deep bulge into the Allied front. Victory, the officers said, was within their grasp. The road to Antwerp lay open. Yet, as Richter watched his breath plume in the air, his mind was not on victory parades. It was on the silence. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet, broken only by the whisper of wind through snow-laden pines. He fumbled in his pocket for a cigarette, his hands, scarred from the fighting around Stalingrad, trembling so violently he could not strike his match. It wasn't the cold. It was the memory of the previous afternoon. His battalion, part of the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, had been advancing through a shallow valley when the world ended. There had been no warning shriek of incoming rounds, no ranging shots that gave a man precious seconds to find a ditch, a crater, anything. One moment, the only sounds were the grinding of panzer tracks and the crunch of boots on snow. The next, the entire valley erupted in a simultaneous cataclysmic detonation of fire and steel. It was as if a giant's fist had slammed down from the sky. The air itself seemed to tear apart. Shells exploded in the trees, sending deadly wooden splinters scything through the air. Others burst on the ground, geysers of earth and snow swallowing men whole. And most terrifyingly, some detonated above the ground, in the air, raining red-hot metal fragments down on men who thought they were safe in shallow depressions. Richter had survived by sheer blind instinct, throwing himself flat as the concussive waves battered him. When the fire lifted as suddenly as it had begun, the valley was a charnel house. The proud panzers were burning hulks. His company, which moments before had been a confident advancing force, was now a collection of broken bodies and dazed survivors. The attack had been utterly broken. As he helped drag a wounded comrade back to their lines, the image was seared into his mind, not of the dead, but of the faces of the living. It was a look he had never seen before, not even in the darkest days in Russia. It was not just fear, it was the hollow, wide-eyed shock of men who had been confronted with something beyond their understanding, a force of nature that operated on a different plane of warfare. Now, in the foxhole, he pulled out his small, water-stained diary. He had kept it since 41, filled with observations, sketches, and the grim poetry of a soldier's life. He uncapped his fountain pen, the ink threatening to freeze. He wrote not of strategy or tactics, but of a visceral, personal truth. We were told the Americans were soft, he scrawled. They relied on their machines because they lacked our fighting spirit. This is a lie. Their artillery, it is not a weapon. It is a judgment. It arrives not as a storm you can watch build, but as a lightning strike from a clear sky. Against the Russians, we learned to dance between the raindrops. Here, the entire sky falls at once. This was the new reality for the German soldier in the West. The greatest terror of the Second World War was not the German Tiger tank or the Japanese Zero. For the men of the Wehrmacht fighting the Americans, it was the sound of nothing at all, followed by the symphony of American artillery. To understand the psychological shock that men like Richter experienced, one must go back to the classrooms of the Eastern Front. For years, the war against the Soviet Union had been the crucible that forged the German army's tactical doctrine and its soldiers' survival instincts. The Eastern Front was a war of scale, of vast armies clashing over immense distances. Artillery was the keen of this battlefield, and the Red Army was a master of its use, employing it in massive, overwhelming barrages. German veterans like Richter had become connoisseurs of artillery fire. They learned to read the sounds. The initial tentative crump of a ranging shot was their first alert. It was a signal granting them a minute, sometimes two, to scatter, to find cover, to warn their comrades. The Soviet bombardments that followed were often immense in volume, a rolling thunder of destruction that could go on for hours, but they were also predictable. The fire would walk across a target area in a methodical pattern. A skilled soldier could listen to the rhythm of the impacts and anticipate where the next concentration would fall, moving through the lulls. The Soviet fire direction was often slow, hampered by less efficient communication and command structures. It could take 10, 15, even 20 minutes from the moment a forward observer spotted a target to the moment the first shells began to fall. This created windows of opportunity, precious time to displace a machine gun nest, to retreat from an exposed position, or to launch a counterattack before the enemy could bring their full weight of fire to bear. This was the hard-won curriculum of survival on the Eastern Front. It was a brutal education, but it was a consistent one, and the rules of the game were understood. When these hardened veterans, the survivors of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the endless retreats, were transferred to the Western Front to face the Americans in Italy, France, and finally the Ardennes, they brought this textbook with them. They arrived with a certain condescension. German propaganda had painted the Americans as a wealthy but unmotivated force, reliant on technology and incapable of the kind of grim, determined fighting the Russians had displayed. They were, in the words of many German officers, cowboys. The first encounter swiftly and violently rewrote the textbook. Consider the experience of Sergeant Ernst Vogel, a tough, cynical NCO who had fought through the meat grinder of the Demyansk pocket. Captured by the Americans in Tunisia in May 1943, he provided a detailed debriefing that survives in historical archives. His unit, part of the Africa Corps, had been pushed back into a defensive position in a waterat, a deep, dry ravine north of Tunis. The position was excellent, offering natural cover from direct fire and concealment from aerial observation. Feeling secure, they had begun to brew their morning coffee, the simple ritual, a tiny island of normality in the chaos of war. Then they saw it. A small, unarmed aircraft, a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, puttered overhead at about 500 meters. It looked like a toy, a fragile contraption of canvas and wood. On the Eastern Front, such a plane would have been ignored or at best met with desultory rifle fire. It posed no immediate threat. Vogel and his men paid it little mind, assuming it was on a photographic reconnaissance mission. They were dead wrong. That unassuming Piper Cub was the unblinking eye of a new kind of god of war. Inside, an American artillery observer was calmly radiating their exact coordinates back to a fire direction center. There were no ranging shots, no preliminary adjustments. 3 minutes after the plane appeared, the world inside the Wadi ceased to exist. The bombardment did not walk into their position. It arrived. Dozens of 105 mil high explosive shells detonated simultaneously, instantly turning the ravine into a kill box. The blasts were synchronized, creating overlapping cones of shrapnel that left no safe space. Air bursts shredded men caught in the open. Ground bursts collapsed the sides of the wadi, burying others alive. The coffee pots, the packs, the weapons, everything was pulverized in a 30-second storm of high explosives and white-hot steel. When the silence returned, it was more profound and terrifying than the noise had been. Of Vogel's company of 123 men, only 11, including himself, were left alive, and most of those were wounded. The unit had been erased not in a prolonged firefight, but in the time it takes to boil an egg. The lesson was brutally clear. The appearance of that little plane was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. German soldiers quickly developed a visceral fear of the grasshoppers. Where the roar of a Soviet Katyusha rocket barrage was terrifying, it was a known terror. The silent, circling Piper Cub represented an unknown, a precision and a speed that their Eastern Front experience had not prepared them for. The terror inspired by the Piper Cub was merely the tip of the spear. The true revolution, the engine that powered this new form of warfare, was hidden miles behind the front lines in unassuming trucks or command posts. This was the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. The difference between American and German artillery doctrine can be understood as the difference between a jazz band and a symphony orchestra. A German artillery battery was like a skilled jazz combo. Each battery commander was a virtuoso, capable of calculating his own firing solutions based on maps, forward observer reports, and his own experience. He would direct his 4 or 6 guns to fire on a target. This system prized initiative and individual competence at the battery level. However, it was inherently limited. Coordinating fire from multiple batteries, especially those from different battalions or even different divisions, was a slow, cumbersome process requiring extensive communication up and down the chain of command. A request for corps-level artillery support from a frontline unit could take hours to be approved and executed, if it was approved at all. The American system, by contrast, was a symphony orchestra, and the FDC was its conductor. Instead of each battery calculating its own scores, all data was fed to a central FDC. This center, staffed by officers and technicians, acted as the brain of the entire artillery regiment, or even larger formations. A single forward observer's call for fire did not go to one battery, it went to the FDC, which could then task not just one, but dozens of batteries from different battalions to engage the same target. This was a force multiplier of staggering proportions. A lone American lieutenant, pinned down with his platoon, could, via his radio, effectively command the firepower of an entire artillery group. The FDC would calculate the precise firing data for each participating battery, accounting for their different locations, gun types, and ammunition stocks, and coordinate the fire mission with breathtaking efficiency. The secret weapon that made this rapid calculation possible was not a weapon at all, but a book, the pre-computed firing table. While Germany relied on its artillery officers to perform complex ballistic calculations in the field, a time-consuming process vulnerable to error under stress, the United States had already done the homework. Back in offices across America, an army of mathematicians, physicists, and most notably, thousands of women working as computers had undertaken a monumental task. Using mechanical calculators, slide rules, and logarithm tables, they solved millions of ballistic equations for every conceivable variable. They accounted for everything: wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, air temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, the temperature of the propellant charges, even the wear of the gun barrel, which affected muzzle velocity and thus range. The results of this colossal intellectual effort were compiled into compact, durable books that every American fire direction officer carried. In the heat of battle, when a call for fire came in, the American officer didn't need to calculate, he simply needed to look up the answer. He would input the target coordinates and the current atmospheric conditions, and the firing table would give him the precise charge, elevation, and azimuth for each gun. What might take a German battery commander 15 minutes of frantic calculation could be accomplished by an American FDC in 2 or 3 minutes. A captured German artillery officer, Major Friedrich Bauer, a former mathematics professor, was allowed to examine these firing tables after his capture. His subsequent report, preserved in Allied intelligence files, was filled with a kind of stunned professional admiration. These tables represent a computational effort of a scale we never imagined, he wrote. They had effectively solved the artillery problem in advance in the comfort of their offices. Our officers, no matter how brilliant, were performing advanced calculus in the mud, under fire. Theirs were simply looking up the solution in a book. It was a difference not of quality, but of system. We were craftsmen, they were industrialists. If the FDC was the brain of the system, then its masterpiece, the technique that delivered a psychological blow as severe as the physical damage, was time on target, universally known as TOT. This was the culmination of American artillery science, a coordination so precise it seemed to bend the very laws of physics and psychology on the battlefield. A conventional artillery barrage, even a heavy one, unfolds over time. The first shells land, then more and more, building to a crescendo. This gave defenders a critical, if brief, window to react. The first explosion was a universal signal: get down. Survival depended on hitting the ground in those first few seconds before the full weight of the barrage arrived. Time on target eliminated that window entirely. The concept was simple in theory, but fiendishly difficult in execution. The FDC would receive a target, an enemy column, an assembly area, a battery position. It would then task multiple batteries scattered across the battlefield at different ranges from the target to fire a coordinated mission. The key was the firing time, because the shells from a battery 5 miles away would take longer to reach the target than shells from a battery only 3 miles away. The FDC would order the more distant battery to fire first, then the closer ones in a precisely timed sequence. The result was that all the shells, dozens, sometimes hundreds of them, would arrive on target in the same devastating 3-second window. The effect on the receiving end was apocalyptic. There was no first explosion. There was only a sudden, simultaneous detonation of the entire world. 1 second silence, the next second, an entire square kilometer of terrain was obliterated in a single, unified cataclysm of sound and force. The concussive waves from dozens of simultaneous explosions amplified each other, creating overpressures that could liquefy internal organs and collapse reinforced bunkers. The shrapnel patterns overlapped perfectly, leaving no safe angles, no dead ground. For the soldiers caught in a TOT, it was a psychologically shattering experience. Their hard-won survival instincts were rendered useless. The act of dropping prone at the first sound, which had saved countless lives on the Eastern Front, was now a death sentence, because the first sound was the only sound, and it was the sound of the entire barrage landing at once. There was no time to react, no time to think, no time to even feel fear. It was simply existence and then non-existence. A German staff sergeant, Kurt Zimmermann, survived a TOT strike during the Battle of the Bulge and described it in a diary later found by American troops. "It is not artillery as we know it," he wrote. "It is something new, something from a future war. You hear nothing, then the world ends. Every shell arrives in the same second. The air bursts kill men who would survive ground bursts. The ground bursts kill men who would survive air bursts. There is no time to dive for cover, no time to reach a hole, no time even to drop flat. You are simply alive one moment and wounded or dead the next. It is the most impersonal and therefore the most terrifying form of death I have ever witnessed." Studies conducted after the war would confirm what men like Zimmerman experienced intuitively. They revealed that a staggering 66% of all artillery casualties occurred in the first few seconds of a barrage. By eliminating those first few seconds, time on target maximized lethality with chilling efficiency. It was not just a tactic, it was the industrialization of death, delivering maximum payload in minimum time. The speed and responsiveness of the American artillery system created a tactical reality that German commanders found both baffling and demoralizing. It democratized firepower in a way previously unimaginable. In the German army, the authority to call for substantial artillery support was reserved for senior officers. A junior lieutenant or a sergeant leading a platoon had no direct access to the guns. His requests had to travel up a rigid chain of command, a process that could take hours. In the U.S. Army, every platoon was, in effect, accompanied by his own personal god of war. The forward observer, or FO, was the linchpin of this system. He was not just an artillery officer attached to an infantry unit. He was a specially trained expert who lived, ate, and fought with the infantrymen he supported. He understood their tactics, their challenges, and their immediate needs. Crucially, he was equipped with a reliable, crystal clear FM radio, a technological marvel compared to the static play AM sets that still equip most German units. This meant that when an American rifle platoon was pinned down by a machine gun nest, the lieutenant in command didn't have to send a runner back to company headquarters to begin a long bureaucratic process. He simply turned to his FO and said, "Take it out." The FO would get on his radio direct to the FDC, and within minutes, often as little as 3 precise and devastating fire would rain down on the enemy position. The contrast was stark. A German artillery battery, considered among the best in the world at the start of the war, could deliver fire in 8 to 10 minutes under ideal conditions. American artillery routinely delivered accurate massed fire in 3 minutes or less. This was not a minor difference. It was a chasm in the time it took a German unit to request support and begin calculating a firing solution. The American supporting fire would have already landed, lifted, and allowed the infantry to assault the now silenced position. This created a crushing asymmetry. A German regimental commander, Oberstleutnant Müller, whose regiment was destroyed near Saint-Lô in July 1944, documented this capability in his final bitter report. A single American infantry company, surrounded in a village, held my entire regiment for 6 hours, he wrote. Every time we attempted to assemble for an assault, artillery fire drove us back, not from one battery, but from what seemed like dozens of batteries. The forward observer with that company, probably a lieutenant or a captain, commanded more firepower than I could bring to bear with my entire regimental artillery. We lost over 400 men attempting to overrun 120 Americans. We failed. Their lieutenant had a direct line to an arsenal I could not even access. This democratization of destruction meant that German forces could never feel secure. Any concentration of troops, any defensive position, any attempt to maneuver could be met almost instantly with overwhelming force. It forced the Germans to disperse, which weakened their offensive punch, or to concentrate and be smashed by the invisible fist of the FDC. It was a tactical dilemma with no good solution. The technological and doctrinal superiority of American artillery would have been meaningless without the colossal industrial muscle that produced it, moved it, and fed it with an endless supply of shells. This was the final crushing weight of the American system, its sheer overwhelming scale. The standard American light howitzer was the M2A1 105mm. It was not necessarily a better gun than its German equivalent in terms of range or shell weight. It was, however, a masterpiece of standardization and mass production. Factories like the Rock Island Arsenal perfected assembly line techniques that produced over 8,500 of these howitzers during the war, each built to precise tolerances that ensured consistent performance. Every U.S. infantry division was equipped with 36 of these guns, organized into highly mobile battalions. And mobile is the key word. American artillery was fully motorized. Their howitzers were towed by trucks or half-tracks that could keep pace with advancing armor on paved roads. A German battery, by contrast, was overwhelmingly reliant on horse-drawn transport. Despite the image of the Blitzkrieg as a fully mechanized force, approximately 80% of the German army's motive power throughout the war came from the horse. A single German 105 mm howitzer required a team of 6 to 8 horses to move, and the process of limbering up, hitching the guns, moving and unlimbering, setting up again, was a laborious process that took a minimum of 2 to 3 hours. And far longer in mud or under fire. The disparity was heartbreaking for the Germans to witness. Gefreiter Paul Richter, no relation to Klaus, assigned to a German artillery battery in Normandy, wrote in his diary, "We watched an American battery displaced during a lull in the fighting. They finished their fire mission. Then trucks appeared, the guns were hitched, and the entire battery drove down the road at high speed. They were gone in 20 minutes. We required 2 hours at a minimum to perform the same evolution. The Americans would be set up in a new hidden position and ready to fire again before we had even finished moving our first gun. We are fighting a 19th century war with horses against an enemy fighting a 20th century war with trucks. The outcome was never in doubt. This industrial advantage extended to the ammunition itself. American shell production was of such a scale and consistency that it seemed limitless to the Germans. American batteries were under no restrictions. They could fire at will, knowing that supply convoys would keep them stocked. German batteries, hamstrung by Allied bombing of factories and rail networks, faced chronic ammunition shortages. By 1944, it was not uncommon for a German battery to be rationed to a mere 2 or 3 shells per gun per day. A German lieutenant, Werner Vogel, documented the ammunition crisis in his war diary. We received 50 shells per gun for the entire week, 50 shells to support an infantry regiment facing continuous American attacks. I was required to justify each fire mission to battalion, explaining why this particular target merited the expenditure of our irreplaceable ammunition. Meanwhile, the American artillery fired thousands of shells daily with no apparent concern for conservation. We fought a poor man's war against a rich man's enemy. This logistical chasm meant that American artillery could maintain a constant, oppressive pressure that the Germans could never hope to match. It was a war of attrition, but one where only one side was doing the attriting. Just when German soldiers thought they had grasped the full, terrifying scope of American artillery, a new horror was unveiled, one that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. This was the VT, or variable time fuse, more commonly known as the proximity fuse. It was a technological marvel so advanced and so secret that its use in Europe was initially forbidden for fear a dud would be recovered by the Germans. The problem with traditional artillery was the fuse. To achieve an air burst, the most lethal type of detonation for troops in the open, gunners had to use a time fuse. This required calculating the precise flight time to the target and manually setting the fuse before loading the shell. It was an imperfect science. Small errors in calculation or changes in wind and temperature during the shell's flight could cause the round to burst too high, doing little damage, or too low, burying itself in the ground before exploding. The proximity fuse solved this problem by putting a miniature radar set inside the nose of the artillery shell. As the shell arced towards its target, this tiny transmitter would broadcast a continuous radio signal. When the shell closed within a certain distance of the ground, typically about 10 to 20 meters, the reflected signal would trigger the detonation. It was a brain inside the shell, guaranteeing a perfectly timed airburst every single time, regardless of atmospheric conditions. The effect on the battlefield was transformative. Against conventional artillery, a soldier's best defense was to throw himself into the nearest ditch or crater the moment the barrage began. The fragments from a ground burst would mostly fly laterally, and a prone soldier in a shallow depression had a reasonable chance of survival. The proximity fuse made this life-saving instinct obsolete. The shell would detonate directly overhead, and the shrapnel would rain down in a perfect, deadly cone. A foxhole was no longer a shelter. It was a trap. The only true protection was a deep bunker with overhead cover, which took time and resources to build. Luxuries rarely available on a rapidly moving front. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, recognizing its potential to break the back of the German offensive in the Ardennes, personally lobbied the Pentagon for its release. Authorization was granted in late December 1944. The first use of proximity-fused artillery shells against ground troops in Europe was a cataclysm for the Germans. Obergreiter Hans Müller, the diarist from the Ardennes, survived a VT fuse barrage and recorded the experience. We had learned on the Eastern Front to go flat at the first explosion. Even shallow depressions offered protection from fragments traveling horizontally. But these shells, these demon shells as we called them, they exploded above us. The fragments came down like steel rain. Men in foxholes, men who should have been protected, were killed by fragments that fell vertically. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and we had no time to dig deep bunkers. We simply died. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical toll. The last vestiges of their survival manual were torn up and burned. The knowledge that there was no cover, no safe procedure, induced a state of paralysis and despair. The will to fight, to move, to even expose oneself was eroded by the certainty of this inescapable death from above. Some units, hardened veterans who had faced down Soviet tank charges, now refused orders to leave their positions and attack. They preferred the possibility of capture or court-martial to the certainty of being annihilated by the demon shells. The Battle of the Bulge was the ultimate test of the American artillery system, and it passed with devastating marks. The German plan had banked on bad weather to neutralize American air power, and for the first week, the skies were indeed overcast. The German commanders believed that without their fighter bombers, the Americans would be helpless. They failed to understand that American artillery did not need clear skies. As the German panzer divisions pushed deeper into the Ardennes, they constantly exposed their flanks, their supply lines, and their assembly areas to the ever-watchful American FOs and their Piper Cubs. Time and again, German attacks were broken up before they could even properly form. Concentrations of tanks and infantry were shattered by precisely coordinated TOT strikes. Attempts to bring up their own horse-drawn artillery were met with swift, brutal counter-battery fire that left guns destroyed and teams of horses dead in the snow. The offensive, planned to reach Antwerp and split the Allied army, stalled in less than a week, its momentum broken not by tanks or planes, but by shells. During the entire Bulge campaign, over 4,000 American guns fired more than 1.2 million artillery rounds. When the weather finally cleared after Christmas, allowing resupply and the return of air power, the defeat was turned into a rout. For the German soldiers who survived and were captured, the journey to prisoner of war camps in the United States was a final, sobering lesson. They saw the endless trains carrying new artillery pieces, the factories working around the clock, the fields full of healthy horses that were used for farming, not for war. They saw the sheer, unassailable industrial might that had produced the system that defeated them in POW camps. Some were even allowed to observe American artillery training. They saw the relentless drills, the seamless coordination between FOs and FDCs, the emphasis on speed and volume. They saw that what they had faced was not a fluke or a unique advantage, but the standard output of a well-oiled machine. The transformation in their understanding was complete. A captured mathematics professor, Major Bauer, attended lectures given by American officers and wrote in his notes, "They have systemized everything we did by individual skill and initiative. Where we depended on talented artillery officers computing firing solutions through experience and calculation, they created tables that allow average officers to achieve superior results. Where we depended on good radio operators maintaining communication under difficult conditions, they produced radios so reliable that even minimally trained operators could maintain contact. They have taken the art of artillery and transformed it into an industrial process, repeatable and scalable. This is the secret of their success." The story of American artillery in World War II is more than a tale of technological innovation. It is the story of the modernization of warfare itself. It demonstrated that in the industrial age, victory would not necessarily go to the side with the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant individual commanders, but to the side that could most effectively integrate organization, technology, training, and industrial production into a single, overwhelming system. For the German soldier, the memory of that system, the silent Piper Cub, the sudden world-ending fury of a time on target, and the inescapable rain of the proximity fuse became the defining horror of the conflict. It was a fear that was impersonal, mathematical, and utterly inescapable. As one veteran who later immigrated to America confessed, the weapon he feared most was the one he never saw. the one that killed from beyond the horizon. It was the knowledge that courage and skill were futile against a perfectly engineered symphony of destruction. That was the true, enduring legacy of the American artillery in the Second World War.